There are certain silences that contain more than words ever could. They are not empty voids, but rooms filled with the furniture of unspoken feelings, decorated with the wallpaper of shared history. For months, Liam and I had been living in a silence like that, a space we had built together, board by board, glance by glance, without ever acknowledging the architecture. It was a comfortable room, but the air was growing thin, charged with a kind of pressure that you feel in the moments before a storm breaks. And on that particular Tuesday night, with the city humming its distant lullaby outside my apartment window, and the low murmur of some forgotten black and white film filling the space between us, I felt the barometer drop. He was asleep, or at least pretending to be, his head a familiar, comforting weight in my lap, his dark hair a soft chaos against the worn denim of my jeans. My fingers, acting of their own accord, were tracing lazy, meaningless patterns through it, a gesture that had become as reflexive as breathing. It was a dangerous habit, this casual intimacy, a slow poison I willingly drank each night. He ended up on my couch. The boundary between friendship and whatever this was had eroded so gradually that I could no longer remember where the shoreline had once been. All I knew was the tide was in, and I was adrift. His breathing was a steady, rhythmic current, the only thing anchoring me in the swirling vortex of my own thoughts. I was so caught up in my analysis, in the painstaking cataloging of every minute detail, the slight twitch of his eyelid, the warmth of his breath against my thigh, the way the lamplight carved a crescent moon along his cheekbone, that I didn't notice the moment his breathing changed, the moment the rhythm hitched and then settled into the slower, more deliberate cadence of wakefulness. He shifted, a small adjustment that sent a tremor through my entire nervous system. His eyes opened. They were a deep, clear brown, and in the dim light of the living room, they seemed to hold the quiet depth of a forest pool. He didn't look at the television, or the ceiling, or the window. He looked directly at me, his gaze so steady, so unervingly present, that I felt pinned in place. The silence stretched, no longer comfortable, but taut, a wire humming with unspoken questions. My hand stilled in his hair. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. And then, his voice, low and rough with sleep, sliced through the tension. "You good?" 3 words. That was all. A simple, throwaway question friends ask each other a dozen times a day. But it wasn't what he said, it was how. It was the weight of it, the genuine inquiry that seemed to look past the surface and peer directly into the carefully constructed fortress of my composure. He wasn't asking if I was comfortable or if I needed to move. He was asking something deeper, something that acknowledged the charged atmosphere he had just woken up in. He was asking if I was okay inside this silence we had built. And in that moment, as his gaze held mine, a strange and profound sense of peace washed over me, quieting the frantic bird in my chest. All the anxiety, the yearning, the fear of misreading every signal, it all just settled. It was the calm in the eye of the storm. For the first time in a very, very long time, I didn't have to pretend. The truth was simple. In that strange, suspended moment, with his head in my lap and the entire world boiled down to the few feet of space between us, I finally was. To understand the weight of that Tuesday night, you have to understand the foundation it was built upon. Our friendship wasn't forged in the crucible of some dramatic, life-altering event. It was assembled slowly, piece by piece, in the quiet, unremarkable corners of college life. I met Liam in an intro to film photography class, a space that was my native habitat, but an alien landscape for him. I was a sophomore, already committed to the solitary, observant life of an artist, my camera a permanent extension of my body, a shield and a lens through which I could safely process the world. He was a junior, a business major with a constellation of friends and a schedule packed with commitments, taking the class, as he later admitted, because he heard it was an easy A and a welcome break from spreadsheets and economic theory. He was sunlight and noise. I was shadow and quiet. On the first day, he sat next to me, all broad shoulders and an easy, dazzling grin that seemed to generate its own light source. He smelled faintly of chlorine and coffee, a combination that spoke of an early morning swim practice followed by a rush to make it to a 9 a.m. class he had no real interest in. He introduced himself with a handshake that was firm and warm, and I remember thinking that his energy was almost overwhelming, like standing too close to a bonfire. In contrast, probably seemed like a closed door. I gave my name, Leo, and offered little else, retreating back into the familiar comfort of checking my light meter and fiddling with the aperture ring on my vintage Minolta. I assumed that would be the end of our interaction. People like Liam, gregarious, effortlessly popular, moving through the world with an uncomplicated confidence, didn't usually gravitate toward people like me, who found more companionship in the chemical scent of a darkroom than in a crowded party. But Liam was an anomaly. He was relentlessly curious. He didn't seem to see my quietness as a barrier, but as a puzzle. He'd lean over during lectures, whispering questions that were surprisingly insightful. "How do you know what to take a picture of?" he'd ask, or "What's the difference between seeing something and really looking at it?" He was fascinated by the darkroom, by the alchemy of turning a blank sheet of paper into a captured moment of time. While other students rushed through their assignments, he would stay late, watching me, his usual boisterous energy subdued to a respectful hush as I moved through the methodical ritual of developing film. He'd watch the image slowly emerge in the tray of developer, his eyes wide with a kind of wonder that was utterly genuine. "It's like magic," he'd say, his voice a low murmur in the safe light's crimson gloom. And in those quiet, shared hours, surrounded by the smell of stop bath and fixer, the stark differences between us began to blur. His world of fraternity mixers and swim meets and business case studies seemed to fade away, and so did my world of solitary walks and hours spent editing photos in the library's basement. We were just two people, watching a ghost of a moment swim into existence. It was in that shared quiet, that mutual appreciation for a slow and deliberate process, that our friendship took root. We started getting coffee after class, then dinner. Our conversations drifted from f-stops and shutter speeds to everything else. He told me about the immense pressure he felt from his father to succeed, about the grueling demands of being a student athlete, about his long-distance relationship with his high school sweetheart, Sarah. He spoke of his life with a kind of frankness that was disarming, as if he were simply narrating a story that happened to be about him. I, in turn, found myself opening up in ways I rarely did. I told him about my fascination with capturing the things people overlooked, the way light fell on a dusty windowsill, the intricate pattern of cracks in a sidewalk, the unguarded expressions on strangers' faces. He listened, truly listened, with an intensity that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't realized I was craving. He didn't just hear the words. He seemed to understand the feeling behind them. He became my most willing, if sometimes reluctant, subject. I have a whole series of photographs from that time, a visual diary of our burgeoning friendship. Liam, laughing, with a smear of chocolate on his cheek at our favorite late-night diner. Liam, looking thoughtful, staring out the window of the campus library, the autumn light catching the gold flecks in his eyes. Liam, exhausted and draped over a starting block after a grueling practice, his body a study in elegant fatigue. He hated having his picture taken, claimed he never knew what to do with his hands, but he let me do it anyway. "Only because it's you, Leo," he'd say, rolling his eyes but offering a small, genuine smile that always reached his eyes. And through the lens of my camera, I began to see him not just as a friend, but as a collection of beautiful, intricate details. The way one corner of his mouth always quirked up before he told a joke. The constellation of tiny scars on his knuckles from a childhood spent climbing trees. The earnest, almost vulnerable look in his eyes when he was concentrating on something. It was a dangerous way to look at a friend, especially a friend who talked about his girlfriend with such easy, uncomplicated affection. The feelings I developed for him were not a sudden landslide, but a slow, geological shift. They grew in the dark, like a roll of undeveloped film, a latent image waiting for the right conditions to become visible. It was an ache that settled deep in my chest, a quiet, constant companion to our friendship. It was there when he'd throw an arm around my shoulders in a casual, brotherly gesture that felt anything but casual to me. It was there when he'd fall asleep on my dorm room floor after a late-night study session, and I'd stay awake for hours, just watching him breathe, terrified and thrilled by his proximity. I became an expert in suppression, a master architect of internal walls. I built a fortress around that part of my heart, convincing myself that the platonic friendship we had was more valuable than the impossible, unrequited love I harbored. It was enough, I told myself, just to be in his orbit. It was enough to be the person he trusted, the one he came to when the pressures of his own life became too much. To risk that for a feeling he almost certainly did not share felt like a form of self-destruction. So I buried it. I smiled and nodded when he talked about Sarah. I offered advice. I became the perfect, supportive, platonic best friend. I learned to live in the quiet room of our silence, never acknowledging the love letter I had written on every single one of its walls. For years, it was enough. The tectonic plates of our lives shifted after graduation. I stayed in the city, building a modest career as a freelance photographer, finding beauty in the urban landscape and the quiet moments of other people's lives. My apartment was my sanctuary, a small, light-filled space that doubled as my studio, my darkroom converted from a ridiculously large walk-in closet. It was a life of quiet rhythms and predictable solitude. Liam, true to form, was launched into the stratosphere. He took a high-powered consulting job that had him living out of a suitcase, flying from city to city, solving complex problems for faceless corporations. He and Sarah had moved in together, an inevitable and expected step. We stayed close, but our friendship existed in the spaces between his travels. It was a friendship of late-night phone calls from anonymous hotel rooms, of quick coffees snatched between his flights, of text messages sent from different time zones. He was living a life that looked, from the outside, like the absolute pinnacle of success. He was brilliant, driven, and on a trajectory that seemed limitless. But whenever we spoke, I could hear a new note in his voice, a subtle dissonance beneath the confident, cheerful harmony he projected to the world. It was a weariness, a kind of loneliness that even a long-term relationship couldn't seem to touch. The constant motion was taking its toll. He was a ship with a powerful engine but no anchor, and I could sense he was drifting further and further from shore. The shift, when it came, was not a sudden earthquake, but the final, inevitable collapse of a structure that had been eroding for a long time. His breakup with Sarah wasn't a single, dramatic event. It was a slow, painful dissolution, a death by 1,000 paper cuts. The distance, the travel, the divergent paths they were on. It all finally became too much to bear. He called me one night from a hotel in Chicago, his voice hollowed out, stripped of all its usual warmth. He told me it was over. He didn't cry. He just sounded empty, like a house that had been cleared of all its furniture. I listened, offering what few words of comfort I could, feeling the vast, useless miles between us like a physical weight. When he finally came back to the city a week later, he didn't go to the apartment he had shared with Sarah. He came to mine. He showed up at my door with a single duffel bag and the haunted look of a refugee. He didn't need to ask. I just stepped aside and let him in. That was the beginning of the change. He was no longer just visiting my life. He was seeking sanctuary in it. The carefully maintained boundaries of our friendship, the ones I had spent years reinforcing, began to dissolve. He was raw, wounded, and for the first time, he seemed to have no energy left for pretense. He just needed a place to be quiet, a place where he didn't have to perform. My apartment became that place. And so the ritual began. It started innocently enough, as these things always do. He'd come over after a brutal week of travel, drained of all energy and social grace. We wouldn't even talk much. We'd order takeout, put on a movie we'd both seen 100 times, and just exist in the same space. The first time he fell asleep on the couch, I remember feeling a jolt of something I couldn't name, a mixture of tenderness and a sharp, piercing panic. He looked so vulnerable, his usual confident posture completely surrendered to exhaustion. The harsh lines of his jaw were softened, His long limbs sprawled in a way that was completely unguarded. I watched him for a long time before carefully draping a spare blanket over him, my movements slow and deliberate, as if I were handling a priceless, fragile artifact. I retreated to my own room, but I left the door ajar. It was a small, almost unconscious gesture, but it felt significant. It was a signal, though I wasn't sure what it was signaling or to whom. An offering of access? A test of a boundary? Or maybe just a foolish, hopeful crack in my own defenses. He didn't stir. The open door remained just an open door, a passage between two rooms, untraversed. Soon, crashing on the couch became a standing arrangement. It was easier than him driving back to his new, sterile bachelor apartment across town, a place that held none of his history and offered none of the comfort he was clearly craving. It became our routine. He'd arrive on a Thursday or Friday night, drop his travel bag by the door with a weary sigh, and gravitate toward the soft cushions of my sofa as if pulled by an invisible force. I never questioned it. I just made sure there was food in the fridge and a clean blanket ready. Our silence deepened, but it changed in character. It was no longer just the comfortable quiet of old friends. It was becoming something else, something heavier and more complex. It was a silence filled with his unspoken grief and my unspoken affection, a potent, volatile mixture. I became a hyper-vigilant observer of his presence. I learned the specific cadence of his breathing as he slept, the way he'd mumble fragments of dreams, the sound his socked feet made on my hardwood floors. My apartment, once solely my own territory, began to feel like a shared space. His scent, that same mix of coffee and something clean and uniquely him, lingered on the couch cushions long after he left. His toothbrush appeared in my bathroom. A spare sweatshirt of his found a permanent home on the back of my desk chair. Our lives were bleeding into one another, the colors mixing to create a new, indefinable shade. The first time he crossed the physical boundary that had remained tacitly in place was on a rainy November night. The city was weeping against my windows, and the sound created a sense of isolation, as if my apartment were the only dry, warm place in the entire world. We were on the couch, a documentary about deep-sea exploration playing on the screen, its narrator's voice a soothing, monotonous drone. Liam was quieter than usual, a deep melancholy clinging to him like the damp air. He had been staring at the screen without really seeing it for the better part of an hour. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his entire year, he shifted. He didn't say anything. He just lay down, turning onto his side, and rested his head on my thigh. My entire body went rigid, every nerve ending fired at once. It was a simple, platonic gesture, the kind a person might make when they are utterly exhausted and seeking uncomplicated comfort from a trusted friend. That was the logical, rational explanation. That was the story I should have told myself. But my heart didn't listen to logic. My heart was screaming. The weight of his head was both a profound comfort and an exquisite torture. I could feel the warmth of him through the fabric of my jeans, a localized star radiating heat into my frozen limbs. I wanted to run my hands through his hair, to offer the comfort he was so clearly seeking. But I was paralyzed by the fear of interpretation, of pushing a boundary he had only tentatively crossed. So I sat there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity, my breath caught in my throat, my entire universe shrinking to that single point of contact. Eventually, his breathing evened out, deepening into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. Only then did I dare to move. My hand, trembling slightly, lifted and settled in his hair. It was as soft as I had always imagined. I started to stroke it, a slow, gentle motion. It was a conversation I was having with myself, a silent confession made to a sleeping man. With every pass of my fingers, I was saying all the things I could never say out loud. I'm here. I see your pain. I love you. He murmured something in his sleep and shifted, pressing his face more firmly against my leg, an unconscious act of seeking more, of burrowing deeper into the offered comfort. A wave of something fierce and protective washed over me. In that moment, he wasn't the confident, successful consultant or the popular jock from college. He was just Liam, tired and sad and seeking a safe harbor. And I, for all my own anxieties and fears, was determined to be that for him. This became the new evolution of our ritual. The couch cuddling. It was a territory of plausible deniability. He was tired. He was stressed. He was still heartbroken over Sarah. He was just seeking comfort. And I was just being a good friend. We never spoke of it. The morning after, he'd wake up, stretch, and shuffle into the kitchen for coffee, as if he'd simply fallen asleep in a normal way. We would talk about his work, my latest photography project, the weather, anything but the fact that he had spent 6 hours with his head in my lap while I memorized the shape of his ear and the pattern of his breathing. The silence was a fragile bubble, and we were both terrified of making the single move that would pop it. I lived for those nights and dreaded them in equal measure. They were a source of intense, secret joy and profound, soul-crushing anxiety. Every time it happened, a silent debate raged within me. Was this just friendship, intensified by grief and exhaustion? Or was it something more? Was he, in his own way, reaching for me, sending signals he himself didn't understand? Or was I just projecting my own desperate desires onto his innocent actions? I felt like a photographer in a darkroom, watching an image slowly, painstakingly emerge in the chemical bath. I could see the faint outlines of something, a shape I desperately wanted to recognize, but it was still too faint, too ambiguous. I was terrified that if I pulled the print out of the developer too soon, the image would be lost forever. Or worse, I'd pull it out and realize I had been seeing a face in the clouds all along, a pattern that wasn't really there. The metaphor of light and dark became my constant companion. My feelings for him were a blinding light that I had to keep hidden in the darkroom of my own heart. To expose them to the harsh, unforgiving light of day felt like it would overexpose the delicate negative of our friendship, burning it out completely, leaving nothing but white, empty space. So I kept the door to that darkroom sealed shut. I nurtured my secret hope in the safe light's gentle, crimson glow, waiting, endlessly waiting, for the image to become clear. This delicate, unspoken dance continued through the winter. The seasons changed outside my window, the bare branches of the trees becoming filigreed with snow, but inside my apartment, the climate remained the same, warm, still, and charged with an impending storm. The ritual became more entrenched, more necessary. The nights he didn't stay over, my apartment felt cavernously empty, the silence no longer comforting but hollow. I found myself unable to sleep, my body unconsciously attuned to his absence, my lap feeling strangely light. I was becoming addicted to the specific brand of sweet agony he provided. I knew it was unsustainable. This quiet purgatory, this space between friendship and something more, was beginning to wear on me. The effort of maintaining my composure, of acting as if his head in my lap was the most normal thing in the world, was utterly exhausting. I was a dam, holding back a reservoir of feeling, and I could feel the microscopic cracks beginning to form, the pressure building to an unbearable degree. Something had to give. Either the dam would break, or I would have to find a way to release the pressure, to walk away from the very thing that was keeping me afloat. The problem was, I didn't know how to do either without drowning us both. The breaking point arrived on a quiet Friday night in late February. A thaw had set in, and the city was shrouded in a thick, damp fog that blurred the edges of everything, making the world outside seem distant and unreal. The dripping sound of melting snow from the fire escape was a slow, melancholic metronome counting down to a moment I didn't know was coming. We were in our usual formation on the couch, his head a familiar weight, the low volume of an old Hitchcock film a faint, suspenseful score for our own quiet drama. But tonight, the atmosphere felt different. The silence wasn't sleepy or comforting. It was awake. It was listening. I was running my fingers through his hair, the gesture now so practiced it felt like a part of me. But tonight, my own touch felt different. It felt less like a mindless comfort and more like a deliberate caress. I was no longer just soothing him. I was communicating, speaking the silent language we had developed. I traced the line of his jaw with my thumb, a small, reckless act of bravery. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. Instead, a barely audible sigh escaped his lips, a sound of surrender. He shifted, not away, but turning his face slightly upward, toward me. And then he opened his eyes. There was no sleep in them. They were clear, focused, and filled with an emotion I couldn't decipher but felt in the pit of my stomach. It was a look of raw, terrifying vulnerability. The air crackled. The sound from the television faded into nothingness. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. My hand froze in his hair. We just stared at each other, suspended in a moment that felt both infinitely long and terrifyingly brief. This was it. The precipice. The point of no return. He broke the silence, but not with a question I could have anticipated. His voice was a bare whisper, fragile and hoarse. Leo, just my name. But he said it like a question, an appeal, a prayer. He said it as if it were the only word he knew. In that single word, I heard all of his confusion, his fear, and a desperate, burgeoning hope that mirrored my own. The dam inside me didn't just crack, it shattered. All the carefully constructed walls, all the years of patient waiting and silent yearning, crumbled into dust. And in their place was a simple, terrifying clarity. I had a choice. I could pretend I didn't understand, retreat back to the safety of our ambiguous friendship, and spend the rest of my life wondering. Or I could take a step off the cliff and trust that there was something below to catch us. I stopped stroking his hair. My hand moved to cup his cheek, my thumb resting gently at the corner of his mouth. His skin was warm, a faint stubble scratching against my palm. I leaned down, my movements agonizingly slow, my eyes never leaving his. I was giving him every possible second to stop me, to turn his head, to say no. I was offering him an escape hatch from my own reckless advance. He didn't take it. He didn't move a muscle. He just watched me, his eyes wide, his lips slightly parted. His stillness was its own form of consent, a silent, breathless permission. The last inch felt like crossing a vast ocean. And then, our lips met. It wasn't a kiss of passion, not in the way the movies show you. There was no fire, no urgency. It was soft. It was hesitant. It was a question and an answer all at once. It was the taste of salt and rain and years of unspoken words. It was a quiet, reverent discovery, like finding a hidden spring in the middle of a desert. It was the sound of a bubble popping, of a long-held breath finally being released. It was everything. The moment ended as quietly as it began. I pulled back slowly, my heart a wild, frantic symphony in my chest. I searched his face for a reaction, for some clue as to what would happen next. His eyes were wide, glistening in the lamplight. He looked stunned, as if he'd been struck by lightning. A flicker of panic, sharp and cold, shot through me. Had I read everything wrong? Had I just committed an act of catastrophic destruction upon the most important relationship in my life? Before I could say anything, before I could try to apologize or explain or take it all back, he scrambled up from the couch. The sudden absence of his weight was dizzying. He stood in the middle of my living room, looking not at me, but at the floor, at the walls, at anything but my face. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of profound agitation. He looked like a man who had woken up in a foreign country with no memory of how he got there. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as if the words wouldn't form. Finally, he mumbled something, a garbled phrase that sounded like, I have to go." He didn't wait for a response. He grabbed his keys from the bowl by the door, snatched his jacket from the hook, and was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing in the suddenly cavernous silence of my apartment. I was left alone on the couch, the lingering warmth on my thigh the only evidence that he had been there at all. The air, which moments before had been electric with possibility, was now thick with the cold, heavy dread of regret. I had exposed the photograph to the light, and it seemed I had burned it to nothing. The next 3 days were a masterclass in psychological torment. My apartment, once my sanctuary, transformed into a prison cell. Every object seemed to mock me. The indentation his head had left on the couch cushion. The sweatshirt he'd left behind, draped over a chair. The damn toothbrush in my bathroom, a cheerful blue monument to my own foolishness. I replayed the kiss over and over in my mind, a relentless, torturous loop. I dissected every millisecond of it, searching for the exact moment I went wrong. Was it when I touched his jaw? Was the kiss too forward? Did I imagine the permission in his eyes? The silence from his end was absolute, a digital wall of impenetrable granite. My first text, a simple, "Are you okay?" sent an hour after he fled, was met with nothing. It sat there, a single blue tick of delivery, a testament to my unanswered plea. The next day, I tried calling. It rang and rang before clicking over to his cheerful, professional voicemail, a recording from another lifetime when everything between us was simple. I didn't leave a message. What could I possibly say? Sorry for misinterpreting months of intense, intimate physical contact and kissing you. The self-recrimination was a corrosive acid eating away at me from the inside. I had been so arrogant, so certain in that final moment. I had mistaken his grief and loneliness for something more, for something directed at me. I hadn't been a safe harbor. I had been an opportunist, taking advantage of his vulnerability. I had shattered the most fundamental rule of our friendship, the unspoken agreement to protect it at all costs. I had prioritized my own selfish, secret wanting over his comfort and our shared history. The quiet room we had built was in ruins, and I was the one who had swung the wrecking ball. By the third day, the anxiety had curdled into a cold, hard knot of despair. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't even pick up my camera. The world seemed to have lost its color, its texture, its interest. All I could see was the ghost of him leaving, the panicked look in his eyes. I knew I couldn't continue to exist in this limbo. The uncertainty was worse than a definitive rejection. A clean break, however painful, would at least allow the healing process to begin. This silence was a wound left to fester. I had to know. I had to face the consequences of my actions, whatever they might be. So, with a sense of grim determination, I put on my shoes, grabbed my keys, and walked out of my apartment. The walk to his place was a journey through a fog of my own making. I barely registered the traffic, the pedestrians, the sounds of the city. My entire focus was narrowed to a single point, the door I was about to knock on. With every step, I rehearsed what I would say. I would apologize unequivocally. I would take all the blame. I would tell him I cherished our friendship more than anything and that I would do whatever it took to go back to the way things were, even if it meant burying my own feelings so deep they would never see the light of day again. It was a lie, of course. There was no going back. But it was the only script I could think of that might salvage something from the wreckage. I stood outside his apartment door for a full 5 minutes, my heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. My hand was raised to knock, but my muscles refused to obey the command. This was it, the end of the line. I finally forced my knuckles to connect with the wood. The sound was pathetically small, yet it seemed to boom in the quiet hallway. I waited. I heard a faint shuffling sound from inside, then nothing. I was about to knock again, my hope shriveling with each passing second, when the lock clicked. The door opened a few inches. Liam stood there, chained by the security latch. He looked terrible. He was wearing the same clothes he'd had on 3 days ago. His hair was a mess, and his eyes were shadowed with exhaustion and something else, something that looked like fear. He stared at me through the gap, his face a mask of conflict. "Leo," he said, his voice a rough, broken whisper. "You shouldn't be here." His words were a punch to the gut, but I held my ground. "I'm not leaving until we talk, Liam," I said, my own voice steadier than I felt. "You can't just disappear. Not after that. You owe me a conversation." He stared at me for a long moment, his jaw tight. I could see the battle raging in his eyes. Finally, with a sigh of complete and utter defeat, he closed the door, slid the chain off, and opened it wide. He didn't invite me in. He just turned and walked back into the dimness of his apartment, leaving me to follow. The place was a mess. Takeout containers littered the coffee table. Clothes were strewn over the furniture. It looked like the physical manifestation of a psychological collapse. He didn't turn on any lights, so we stood in the gloom of the late afternoon, the blinds drawn against the world. He wouldn't look at me. He just stood by the window, his back to me, his shoulders slumped. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I decided to go first. to deliver the apology I had rehearsed. Liam, I'm so sorry. I began, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. I misread everything. I crossed a line, and I never should have. Our friendship is the most important thing to me, and I completely ruined it. I'll do anything to fix it. He flinched at my words, but didn't turn around. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low I could barely hear him. You didn't misread everything. The words hung in the air between us, completely derailing my prepared speech. I was so ready for a rejection that his quiet contradiction left me speechless. He finally turned to face me, and the raw agony on his face stole my breath. His eyes were red-rimmed, his expression haunted. That's the problem, Leo, he said, his voice cracking. You didn't misread it. I don't know what's happening. I don't feel this way. About guys. About anyone but Sarah. He ran a hand through his hair, his movements jerky and agitated. And then you and I. When you kissed me, it didn't feel wrong. And that scares the hell out of me. He started pacing the small living room, a caged animal. I felt it too. All those nights on your couch. I wasn't just tired. I was, but it was more than that. Your apartment was the only place I felt quiet. The only place my head would shut up. And being near you had helped. I told myself it was just because you're my best friend. But then it became something I needed. I'd be in some hotel room in Dallas, and all I could think about was getting back to your couch. He stopped and looked at me, his eyes pleading, desperate for me to understand something he couldn't articulate himself. What does that mean, Leo? What am I supposed to do with that? I've spent my whole life on one road, and now I feel like I'm standing in the middle of a forest with no map and no compass. Kissing you, it made it real. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was a thing that happened. And I panicked. I ran because I didn't want it to be real. His confession washed over me. A tidal wave of relief, so profound it almost brought me to my knees. I wasn't crazy. I hadn't imagined it. The connection, the pull, the unspoken current between us, it was real. It was mutual. But my relief was quickly tempered by a deep, aching sympathy for the turmoil he was in. He was terrified, and his fear had made him cruel. A part of me was still hurt, still angry at being abandoned in the rubble of that beautiful, fragile moment. But seeing him now, so utterly lost and broken, I couldn't hold on to the anger. So you ran, I said, my voice soft. You ran, and you left me alone to think I had just destroyed everything. He had the grace to look ashamed. I know, he whispered. I'm sorry. I was a coward. I was so scared of what it meant, for me, for us. I didn't know how to face you. I didn't know how to face myself. I closed the distance between us, stopping just a few feet away. Liam, I said, my voice firm but gentle. Look at me. He slowly lifted his head, his gaze meeting mine. I don't have a map either. I'm just as scared as you are of what this could mean for our friendship. But hiding from it isn't the answer. Avoiding me isn't the answer. We have to talk about it. Honestly, whatever it is, whatever we decide, we have to do it together. I held his gaze, trying to pour all the patience and reassurance I could muster into my expression. I'm not going to pretend I don't have feelings for you. I think I have for a very long time. But I would rather have an honest friendship with you than a relationship you're not ready for, or one that you're terrified of. The one thing I can't do, the one thing I won't do, is go back to that silence. We have to talk for a long time. He just stood there, searching my face. I could see the war still raging inside him, the fear battling with the undeniable truth of his own feelings. I let him have the silence, let him process, let him arrive at his own conclusion. The survival of whatever we were depended on his choice being his own, not one he was pressured into. Finally, a long, shuddering breath escaped him, and some of the tension seemed to drain from his shoulders. He took a hesitant step toward me, then another, until he was standing directly in front of me. He didn't touch me. He just looked at me, his eyes filled with a universe of confusion and a tiny, flickering star of hope. Okay, he whispered. Okay, let's talk. And so we did. We sat on his uncomfortable, stylish sofa that offered none of the worn-in comfort of mine, and we talked for hours as the afternoon faded into evening and the evening bled into night. It wasn't a single, eloquent conversation. It was messy, halting, and repetitive. It was full of long pauses and difficult admissions. We dismantled the entire structure of our friendship, examining every beam and joint, trying to understand how and when it had transformed. We talked about the nights on the couch, the open door, the unspoken needs. He admitted that he had started leaving his own bedroom door open in his apartment, a subconscious echo of my gesture, hoping for an intrusion he didn't know how to ask for. I confessed the depth and longevity of my feelings, the years I had spent carefully guarding my heart. I told him about the exquisite agony of those nights, of wanting so much more but being terrified to ask for it. He listened, his expression a mixture of awe and regret. He talked about his relationship with Sarah, how he had loved her, but how it had always felt like he was playing a role he had been cast in, the part of the successful boyfriend, the future husband. He said that with me. He never felt like he was performing. He could just be. He admitted that the comfort he found with me was different, deeper, and that the realization had terrified him because it didn't fit into the blueprint he had for his life. There were tears. His were of confusion and fear. Mine were of relief and a kind of grief for all the time we had lost to silence. We laid all the unspoken things out between us, turning the shadowy contents of our quiet room out into the light. It was painful and frightening, but with every honest word, I could feel the foundation of something new and stronger being laid beneath us. Sometime after midnight, an exhausted peace settled over us. We had said everything there was to say for now. The questions had been asked, the fears voiced, the feelings acknowledged. We were left in a new kind of quiet, one that wasn't filled with tension or unspoken yearning, but with a fragile, tentative understanding. He looked at me, his eyes weary but clear for the first time in days. "Can I?" he started, then stopped, seeming unsure how to ask. "Can I stay at your place tonight?" The question was loaded. He wasn't asking to crash on the couch. We both knew what he was asking. He was asking to come home. I didn't hesitate. "Yeah," I said softly. Of course, we gathered a few of his things in a bag, a silent, symbolic act of leaving the old, confused space behind. We walked back to my apartment through the deserted, sleeping city streets. We didn't talk much on the way. We didn't need to. For the first time, we didn't hold hands, but our arms brushed against each other with every step, a simple, grounding contact that spoke more than words. Back in the familiar territory of my apartment, the air felt different, cleansed. The ghosts of anxiety and misunderstanding had been exorcised. I went into my bedroom, and he followed, a quiet shadow behind me. There was no grand, passionate scene. It was something far more profound. We changed into sleeping clothes in a comfortable silence, then slipped under the covers of my bed. It felt both completely revolutionary and utterly natural. He turned onto his side to face me, the moonlight from the window painting a silver stripe across his face. He reached out and tentatively took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. The simple contact was an anchor, a promise. We didn't kiss again that night. We didn't need to. We just lay there, face to face, holding hands, our legs tangled together. We were learning a new grammar, a new way of being with each other. This wasn't about desire, not yet. It was about safety. It was about creating a new kind of silence, one built on a foundation of honesty. I watched him fall asleep, the lines of fear and confusion on his face finally smoothing out, replaced by a deep and peaceful exhaustion. I stayed awake for a long time after, just listening to him breathe, feeling the steady weight of his hand in mine. The frantic bird in my chest was finally still, its wings folded in quiet contentment. I had found my way out of the darkroom, and the image that had developed was more beautiful and intricate than I had ever dared to hope. We were just at the beginning, I knew. There would be more questions, more fears, more difficult conversations as Liam navigated this new continent within himself. But we would do it together. We had chosen the terrifying, beautiful light over the comfortable, lonely dark. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee. I opened my eyes, and for a disoriented moment, I thought I had dreamed the entire thing. But the other side of the bed was warm, and Liam's scent lingered on the pillow. I got up and walked into the kitchen to find him standing by the counter, shirtless in a pair of sweatpants, pouring hot water into the French press. He looked up when I entered, and a slow, shy smile spread across his face. It was a real smile, one that reached his tired eyes. "Morning," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my heart doing a slow, happy flip in my chest. He handed me a mug, and our fingers brushed. The small shock of contact was still new, still electric. We stood there for a moment, drinking our coffee in a silence that was easy and full of unspoken promise. The new normal. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic change, but a series of small, quiet shifts. The bedroom door was closed now, not as a barrier, but as a boundary around the new, shared space we were creating. The couch was still used for watching movies, but it was no longer a stage for our ambiguous ritual. Now, we sat closer, my head on his shoulder or his arms slung around me, with no pretense, no plausible deniability. It was just us. A few nights later, we were lying in bed, reading in the companionable silence that was quickly becoming my favorite thing in the world. I was watching him, the way the lamplight caught the curve of his eyelashes, the way he chewed on his lower lip when he was concentrating. He seemed to feel my gaze on him and looked up from his book. He smiled that soft, private smile that I was coming to realize was reserved just for me. He put his book down and shifted closer, resting his head on my chest, his ear right over my heart. I wrapped my arms around him, holding him close. We lay like that for a long time, the only sounds the turning of my pages and the steady, synchronous rhythm of our breathing. His presence was a warmth that seeped into my very bones, chasing out the last vestiges of the lonely chill I had lived with for so long. He tilted his head back to look up at me, his brown eyes soft and clear in the warm light. His expression was open, unguarded, full of a quiet wonder, as if he were still marveling at how we had ended up here. He reached up and touched my face, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw, a gentle echo of the gesture that had started it all. And then he asked the question, the same 3 words from that night on the couch that now felt like a lifetime ago. But this time, the context was entirely different. It was no longer a question born of tension and uncertainty. It was an inquiry born of love, of care, of genuine concern for my happiness. It was a check-in, a confirmation, an affirmation of the safe place we had built. "You good?" he whispered. I looked down at this beautiful, complicated man who had stumbled into my life and rearranged all the furniture, who had torn down my walls and built a home in their place. I thought of the long, lonely years of secret affection, the painful anxiety of our unspoken dance, the terror of the fallout, and the profound, healing peace of the aftermath. I thought about how his hand felt in mine, how his laughter was the best sound I had ever heard, and how the simple act of waking up next to him felt like a quiet miracle. A smile spread across my face, genuine and effortless. I tightened my arms around him and pressed a kiss to the top of his head, breathing in the scent of him. "Yeah," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I no longer had to hide. "I'm good." And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that as long as I was with him, I always would be. We had made it through the storm. We had found our harbor. We learned that the most important structures in our lives aren't built with wood and nails, but with the terrifying, courageous act of telling the truth. The quiet room we had once inhabited, full of shadows and unspoken things, was gone. In its place, we had built something new. A home, with the windows thrown wide open to let in the light. And in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, we finally began to heal.